October 1979. The morning air along the Illinois River was sharp and clean, the kind that stung your lungs when you breathed too fast. Fog still rolled across the surface, soft and pale, swallowing the sound of the water as it lapped against the banks. A local fisherman named Harold Dean stood knee-deep near the shoreline, his line cast into the current. He'd been out since dawn, the kind of man who preferred the quiet before the world woke. The river was calm, only the ripples of small fish breaking its mirror surface. Then something drifted toward him, slow and unnatural. A dark shape caught in the reeds along the bend, large, rectangular, waterlogged. At first he thought it was an old cooler, maybe a suitcase fallen off a passing boat. He moved closer, boots sinking into the mud with every step. The shape bumped softly against the reeds. It was a suitcase. A faded brown leather one, the kind made decades ago, its brass latches rusted and half broken. It looked old, heavy, swollen from days in the water. When Harold reached for it, the smell hit him, sweet at first, then sour, the smell of something that should not be there. He pulled back, heart pounding. He knew instantly what he had found. He stumbled up the bank, nearly dropping his tackle box. His breath came in short bursts as he ran toward his truck, parked near the bridge. He drove straight to the nearest sheriff's office, his hands shaking the entire way. By mid-morning, police tape cut across the riverbank. Deputies crouched near the water, their flashlights glinting off the slick, wet leather of the suitcase. The sun had burned through the fog now, and what it revealed would stay in every man's memory who stood there that day. The coroner arrived by noon. He wore a tan trench coat and carried a clipboard, his expression unreadable. The suitcase was gently pulled from the water and set on a tarp. Cameras clicked, flashes stark against the dull gray sky. When they opened it, silence fell. Inside, wrapped carefully in a blanket, was the body of a young woman. She was not tossed or discarded. She had been placed. Her arms folded neatly across her chest, her hair arranged as though someone had tried to give her dignity, even in death. The coroner leaned closer. Her features were soft, early 20s, skin pale from the water. There were no visible wounds, no signs of violence that the eye could see, but there was something deliberate in how she was hidden, as if whoever put her there had known her. A deputy whispered, "Who would do this?" No one answered. The sheriff looked up at the sky, then back at the river. He'd worked this county 20 years and never seen anything like it. He ordered the scene secured, every footprint marked, every piece of debris photographed. They lifted the body from the case, wrapped it in white plastic sheeting, and carried it carefully to the waiting coroner's van. As the van doors shut, the sound echoed across the valley, a sound that would stay with the town for decades. The news spread by evening. Body found in river. Unidentified young woman. Headlines rolled through Illinois like a quiet wave of dread. Reporters came, their voices hushed as they filmed the riverbank, the yellow tape fluttering in the wind. The people of the small town watched from their porches. They whispered her story before they even knew her name. Some said she was a runaway, others thought she'd been dumped there by a passing trucker. But for most, it was simpler. They just called her the girl in the river. At the county morgue, the coroner's report began that night. Female, estimated age, between 20 and 25. Height, 5'4". Weight, roughly 100 pounds. Cause of death, undetermined. Time of death, 1 to 2 weeks before discovery. There were no personal items in the suitcase, no purse, no wallet, no jewelry. Her fingerprints were lifted carefully and sent to the state database. The results came back 2 days later. No match. Detective Raymond Hale was assigned lead investigator. A seasoned officer with a quiet disposition, Hale was known for his precision and for his empathy. He spent that first night standing beside the river, hands in his pockets, watching the current. The suitcase sat open on the ground beside him, empty now, the inside stained by the water. He imagined the girl alive. Maybe she'd stood on this same bank once, watching the river move. He wondered who she was, who had loved her, who had missed her. Somewhere, he thought, there had to be a mother still waiting for a phone call that would never come. He made a promise then, whispered under his breath as the sun disappeared behind the trees. "I'll find your name." The promise of one man to one unknown girl, carried away by the sound of the river. The current moved on, calm again, as if nothing had ever happened. But beneath that stillness the river held its secret tight, and for 43 years it would not let it go. By the second morning the story had already spread across 3 counties. Small-town radio stations repeated the same lines over and over. Unidentified young woman found in river near LaSalle County, possible homicide. For most listeners, it was just another grim headline. For Detective Raymond Hale, it was the beginning of something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He arrived at the riverside just after dawn. The fog had lifted, but the air was still cold, carrying the faint smell of algae and mud. The crime scene remained cordoned off, the suitcase gone, the footprints now photographed and cast in plaster. A deputy stood watch near the tape, sipping coffee from a metal thermos, his eyes red from a sleepless night. Hale nodded to him and stepped down the slope. His boots sank into the damp soil. He stopped where the suitcase had been found. The reeds swayed lightly in the current, innocent and indifferent. He crouched, running his hand along the earth. It was soft, disturbed recently, but the rain overnight had erased any clear tracks. "Nothing new?" he asked without looking up. The deputy shook his head. "Lab picked up the suitcase this morning. They'll dry it out, try to lift prints, but I doubt they'll find much. The water's been working on it too long." Hale sighed. "We'll check anyway." He looked at the water again, calm, unbothered, and felt that familiar heaviness settle behind his ribs. He had seen death before, but this was different. There was no sign of anger, no chaos. Whoever had done this had been deliberate, gentle almost. Back at the station, the day's routine chaos filled the corridors, phones ringing, typewriters clattering, the hum of fluorescent lights that made everything feel colder. Hale carried the coroner's report in one hand and a cup of burnt coffee in the other. He laid both on his desk and began to read. Autopsy summary: female, Caucasian, approximately 22 to 25 years old. No signs of external trauma, no gunshot, no blunt force fractures. Lungs contained trace amounts of water. Possible drowning, though post-mortem submersion cannot be ruled out. Small contusion on right temple, consistent with fall or blow. Cause of death: undetermined. He stared at that last line. Undetermined. The word carried too much weight. Her body had been found wrapped in a blanket, an act of care, not cruelty. That single detail turned the case from a statistic into something personal. He turned the page. Beneath the report lay 3 photographs clipped together: the girl's face, the suitcase, the riverbank. She looked peaceful in the photo, her hair spread like dark silk against the sheet, her features calm, almost asleep. Someone had taken time with her, time to wrap her carefully, to hide her gently. Hale leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. "Who are you?" he muttered under his breath. By noon, the sheriff called a meeting. The conference room smelled of stale coffee and paper. A map of the Illinois River was pinned to the wall, a red mark where the body had been found. "We're treating this as homicide," the sheriff said flatly. "No ID, no missing person match so far. The coroner's report doesn't tell us much, but we've got a few leads to check." He pointed at the map. "That stretch of river sees truck traffic, 3 interstate rest stops within 20 miles. We'll need to talk to drivers, motel clerks, anyone who might have seen a woman traveling alone." Detective Hale nodded. "What about the suitcase brand?" "Already checked. Manufactured by Samsonite, early 70s model. Sold nationwide. Serial number worn off." Another officer spoke. "We found fabric fibers inside the lining. Blue wool, maybe from a coat. And there's residue that looks like perfume." Sweet floral Hale made a note. Details mattered. Even the scent of perfume could tell a story. They finished the meeting with assignments. Hale took lead on field interviews. 2 deputies handled the rest stop surveillance logs. Others checked missing person files across Illinois, Iowa, and Michigan. That afternoon, Hale visited the diner off Route 6, the kind of place where gossip traveled faster than newsprint. He sat at the counter, ordered coffee, and showed the waitress a copy of the composite sketch, drawn from the coroner's notes and an artist's reconstruction. She looked at it for a long moment. "Hard to say," she murmured. "She looks like half the girls that come through here. College age, traveling light. We get a lot of hitchhikers heading toward Chicago. Anyone stop in during the last few weeks who seemed off? Nervous?" She thought for a moment, wiping her hands on her apron. "There was a girl, maybe a month ago, pretty, wore a green jacket and jeans, said she was catching a ride north. I remember her because she tipped well. Most travelers don't. She said she was heading for art school." The waitress shook her head. "No, but she had a sketchbook with her. Drew the river while she waited for her food." Hale's pulse quickened slightly. "You sure about that?" She nodded. "I remember. She said she liked the way the water looked, said it was like it had secrets." Hale folded the sketch carefully and stood. "Thank you." As he walked out into the parking lot, he stared at the horizon. The sun shimmered over the river beyond the trees. A girl with a sketchbook drawing the river. A suitcase found floating in it weeks later. It wasn't proof, but it was something. Back at the station, he added a note to the file. Possible ID link. Female artist, traveler, green jacket, sketchbook. He sent a bulletin to nearby states requesting information on missing women fitting that description. Days passed, then weeks. Dozens of calls came in, false leads, mistaken identities, old rumors. Every time the phone rang, Hale felt the same flicker of hope, followed by the same hollow silence when it led nowhere. The fingerprints came back again, still no match. Dental records, nothing. In 1979, national databases were still decades away. Every search meant letters, phone calls, manual comparisons. The press began to lose interest. Reporters moved on to other stories, robberies, elections, winter storms. But Hale stayed with it. He couldn't let it go. One evening, he sat at his desk long after everyone had gone home. The office was quiet except for the low hum of the vending machine. He opened the file again, looked at the photo one more time. He imagined her story. Maybe she had come from somewhere far away. A girl chasing a dream, hitching rides, writing letters home that would never be received. Maybe she'd trusted the wrong person. Maybe she'd been loved once. He closed the folder slowly, placed it on top of the stack, and turned off the desk lamp. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the sound of the river with it. In his gut, Hale knew one thing for certain. The girl had not been forgotten by the river. She had simply been waiting for someone to listen, and somewhere out there, someone still remembered her face. The search would go on, but the answers, like the current, kept moving just beyond reach. Winter came early that year. The trees along the Illinois River turned bare before December, their branches stark against a gray sky. Snow fell light and constant, covering the small towns and farmhouses in a soft, indifferent quiet. For most of the county, life went on. But inside the sheriff's department, one file sat heavier than all the rest. The tag on its spine read simply, Jane Doe, number 17, 1979. It rested on the corner of Detective Hale's desk, beneath a cup ring and a stack of older reports. He never buried it under paperwork. He wanted it where he could see it. Every morning when he hung his coat, his eyes went to that folder. Every night when he turned off the lamp, it was the last thing he touched. The coroner filed her body officially as unidentified on December 8, 1979. A formal death certificate had to be printed, the kind of administrative act that feels cruel in its precision. Under name, it read, unidentified female. Under date of death, October estimated. Under cause, undetermined. The morgue could only keep her so long. By law, unidentified remains were to be interred after 90 days unless new evidence surfaced. So the county purchased a small plot in a public cemetery just outside LaSalle. A temporary wooden marker was hammered into frozen soil, painted white, with black stenciled letters, unidentified female, 1979. The grave sat near the back, beside a line of other anonymous markers from accidents, overdoses, and unclaimed lives. But even among them, hers seemed to draw attention. Within weeks, someone, no one knew who, began leaving flowers, always white chrysanthemums, always tied with a piece of twine. Some said it was the fisherman who found her, others thought it was a nurse from the morgue. Hale never asked. He only knew that someone else felt what he felt, that she didn't deserve to be forgotten. Through the first months of 1980, the case crawled forward. Hale and his small team checked missing person bulletins from across the Midwest. They combed through newspaper archives, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa. He wrote letters by hand to other departments, describing the girl's features, the clothes she wore, the blanket she was found in. Most never replied. A few sent back photographs of missing women, most with eyes too bright, smiles too hopeful. Hale compared each one to the morgue photo until the faces blurred together. One night, he sat in the evidence room under buzzing fluorescent light. He laid out the items taken from the suitcase and blanket, fragments of clothing, a single silver button. He ran his hand along the blanket's edge. The stitching was uneven, homemade. It wasn't something store-bought. Someone had cared enough to wrap her in something made by hand. He whispered quietly, "Who covered you like that?" By spring, the press had given her a name. It started with a small headline in the LaSalle County Chronicle, "Who was the girl in the river?" The nickname spread faster than the case itself. Television reporters came, filmed the bridge, the banks, the sheriff's office. They asked the same questions everyone else had asked, and left with the same silence. To the townspeople, she became a story. A symbol of sadness they didn't fully understand but couldn't look away from. Church groups mentioned her in Sunday prayers. Children whispered her legend at sleepovers, the river girl who never found her way home. Hale didn't like the attention. He wanted her real name, not a headline. He kept working quietly, methodically, refusing to let the case become folklore. In June, a break came, or seemed to. A call from Iowa. A missing woman, 23, vanished around the same time. Similar height, similar hair color. Hale drove 4 hours to meet with local police, carrying photos and the autopsy report. The missing woman's mother met him in the sheriff's lobby, holding a small locket with her daughter's picture. Her hand shook as she opened it. "Her name's Kelly," she said. "She was last seen hitchhiking toward Chicago." Hale showed her the photograph of Jane Doe, printed on matte paper, gray and flat under the lights. The woman stared at it for a long time before shaking her head. "No," she whispered, "that's not my girl." Hale thanked her, drove home in silence. The road blurred under the headlights. He turned off the radio. He couldn't bear the sound of voices tonight. When he returned to the station, he filed another dead lead into the folder. The case felt endless, a maze with no exits. By 1982, he was one of only 2 detectives still occasionally working the file. Others had moved on, promotions, retirements, new priorities. He kept the evidence sealed, preserved in its original boxes. Once, during an inspection, the sheriff asked him, "Why keep reopening that one? You've got newer cases that might still go somewhere." Hale looked at him and said quietly, "Because she didn't stop existing just because we stopped looking." The sheriff said nothing more. Years rolled by. Technology advanced, but slowly. Fingerprint systems became digital, but without a match, they meant nothing. DNA was still a whisper, a term spoken in labs, not police stations. The river case faded into archives, mentioned only when someone new joined the department and asked about that suitcase story. Most of the old-timers would shake their heads, say, "No name, no leads, just a ghost in the river." But Hale didn't see her as a ghost. He saw her as a young woman who had once breathed, dreamed, drawn the world around her. He kept a copy of her sketch artist's portrait pinned to his corkboard. Sometimes, when the building was quiet, he'd look at it and imagine her voice. In 1985, on the 6th anniversary of her discovery, Hale visited her grave. Snow flurries drifted across the cemetery, covering the marker until the letters nearly disappeared. He brushed the snow away with his glove and placed a small river stone on top, smooth, gray, shaped by water. "Still working on it," he murmured. He stood there for a long time, hands deep in his coat pockets, breath clouding in the cold. When he finally walked away, he didn't look back. But he knew he'd return. Years later, others would call that decade the Jane Doe era, a time when countless women remained unnamed, their identities lost in the gaps between states and technology. But for one small-town detective, those nameless files weren't numbers. They were promises left unfulfilled. He didn't know it then, but somewhere in a basement evidence locker, a small scrap of bone and a few strands of hair were waiting for science, waiting for time, waiting for the moment the world would finally be able to listen. The river had not forgotten. It was only holding her name until someone learned how to ask the right question. By 1986, the file on the girl in the river had already been moved twice, first from the active case drawer to pending, then to the steel filing cabinet in the back room labeled cold storage. Inside, the air smelled of dust, paper, and quiet resignation. The cabinet drawers were lined with stories that had no endings. Hers was just one more among them. Detective Raymond Hale still came by sometimes. He'd pull the folder out, read it again, as though he might notice a word or a note he'd somehow missed before. Each time he'd find the same thing, silence staring back at him from between the lines. The girl had never been claimed. The fingerprints, the sketches, the public appeals, they'd all led to the same nowhere. The sheriff's department had changed leadership. The new sheriff was younger, numbers-minded, eager to modernize. To him, the 1979 River case was a relic of an era before efficiency. He once told Hale, "You did what you could. Sometimes that's all we get." Hale only nodded. He didn't argue, but inside, he felt the weight of those words like a sentence. That winter, the county bought new storage boxes. Old cardboard was replaced with acid-free containers stamped with barcodes. Each time Hale saw the evidence transferred into something sterile and clean, it felt like another layer of distance between her and the living. The suitcase was tagged and sealed in plastic. The blanket, carefully folded, was locked away. A single human tooth, catalogued for future dental reference, went into an envelope the size of his palm. He made sure the evidence locker log included one note in bold handwriting: "Do not destroy. Retain indefinitely." Most officers never looked twice at that line, but Hale meant it literally. He wasn't ready to let her go, even if everyone else had. The late 1980s blurred into the early 90s. New crimes filled the headlines: serial cases, missing children, the rise of national forensics databases. All of it pushed the older files further into obscurity. By 1992, Hale was nearing retirement. His hair had turned gray, his hands slower. The world around him was changing faster than he could keep up. Computers began appearing on desks, humming softly beside the typewriters they hadn't yet replaced. Detectives talked about new kinds of evidence, DNA, fiber analysis, digital records. He listened but didn't speak much. He'd seen too many promises of technology that came too late for the people who needed them most. Still, part of him hoped. He kept a clipping from a magazine article about the first criminal conviction using DNA evidence pinned above his desk. He'd underlined one line in red ink: "The future of identification lies in blood." He thought about the girl in the river when he read that. If DNA could speak for the dead, maybe one day she'd finally have her voice. In 1994, he retired quietly. No party, no ceremony. He cleared his desk, placed the Jane Doe file in a sealed evidence crate, and left a note on top: "Unsolved. Please preserve." He walked out of the station for the last time and drove home along the same road that wound past the river. The morning mist hung low over the water, just as it had the day she was found. He pulled over near the bridge, stepped out, and leaned on the guardrail. The current below was steady and cold, carrying fallen leaves downstream. He watched it for a long time before whispering, "I kept my promise as far as I could." He didn't stay to see the sunrise. He just got back in his truck and drove home, leaving the river to keep its secret. For years afterward, the case faded into near myth. Local kids told stories about the river ghost who appeared on foggy mornings. Older residents remembered the headlines but forgot the details. Her grave marker weathered, the paint fading until the letters barely showed. Every few years, a new detective would stumble across the file while doing an inventory check. They'd open it, skim the first page, shake their head, and file it back again. There were no new clues, no new leads. Just the same photographs, the same autopsy report, the same unanswered questions. In 2001, a major flood swept through the county. When the sheriff's office basement flooded, dozens of old boxes were damaged. Some were lost completely. When the cleanup came, the girl in the river's evidence crate was found at the edge of a soaked shelf, mud-streaked but intact. A clerk, not knowing what it was, moved it upstairs to dry. That small act, an ordinary piece of housekeeping, would end up saving everything that mattered. The suitcase, the blanket, the bone samples, they all survived. And with them, so did her chance at being found. Meanwhile, Hale lived quietly in a small house outside town. He rarely spoke about the job. He spent mornings tending his garden, evenings reading old case studies. He never stopped wondering. Sometimes he'd drive past the cemetery where she was buried. He never stopped there in daylight. He preferred the dusk, when the headstones cast long shadows across the grass. He'd park just beyond the gate, sit in his truck, and watch the horizon. He once told a neighbor, "Some stories end without a period. You just have to live with the unfinished sentence." That's how he saw it. Unfinished, but not forgotten. By the mid-2000s, forensic genealogy was beginning to take shape. Ancestry databases, open-source DNA comparison tools, a new generation of scientists who believed no one should stay nameless. But in LaSalle County, those advances were just background noise. Budgets were tight, priorities elsewhere. The old Jane Doe cases remained untouched. Until one day in 2019, when a young detective named Anna Morales began a project to digitize unsolved files for the department's new computer archive. She'd been assigned the task reluctantly by her captain. It was tedious work, scanning yellowed documents and retyping old reports into digital forms. But Morales had a quiet fascination with stories that didn't end. When she opened the drawer marked cold storage, the first file she pulled out was Jane Doe 17, the girl in the river. She ran her thumb across the faded folder edge and frowned at the note taped to the front, unsolved. Please preserve someone's handwriting, sharp, steady, different from the rest. She didn't know whose it was yet, but she could feel it. Whoever had written those words had cared deeply. She opened the file, read the first page, and stopped at the black and white photograph clipped to the corner. A girl's face, calm, young, almost peaceful. Morales sat back in her chair, and somewhere deep inside, she made the same promise that another detective had made 4 decades before. Everyone deserves a name. Detective Anna Morales had never heard of the girl in the river until that morning. It was early spring of 2019, and the station was quiet except for the sound of the scanner whirring across another yellow document. She'd been assigned the digital archiving project as a kind of busy work, something to occupy slow weeks when there weren't enough active cases to chase. Most files were routine, thefts, domestic disturbances, petty fraud. But when she opened the next cardboard box from the cold case archive, something about it stopped her. Inside was a single file, thin and carefully labeled in faded blue ink. Jane Doe, number 17, 1979, River Case. Taped to the corner was an old note written in a steady hand. She read it twice. Unsolved. Please preserve. It wasn't a procedural instruction. It was a plea. Morales set the note aside and opened the folder. The paper smelled faintly of dust and time, edges frayed, typewritten letters slightly blurred from decades of handling. She turned the first page. Initial report, October 21, 1979. The next page, autopsy summary. The next, investigator's notes, Detective R. Hale. She frowned. She didn't recognize the name. The department roster on her wall only went back to 1985. The first photograph slid out from between the pages, a black and white print, slightly creased. A young woman's face, eyes closed, hair brushed neatly away from her forehead. Morales froze. There was something haunting about the calmness in that image. The composition didn't look like a crime scene photo. It looked like a portrait. Whoever had taken it, she thought, must have felt the same quiet reverence she did now. She kept flipping. Photos of the riverbank, the suitcase, the plaster casts of footprints that led nowhere. Each image was a frozen fragment of the same unanswered question. Who was she? By noon, Morales had read every page of the file twice. She knew the facts. Female, age estimated 22 to 25. Body found wrapped in a blanket inside a suitcase. No ID, no fingerprints, no dental match. Death classified as undetermined. Buried under county authority as unidentified. The case had been dormant for nearly 40 years. And yet, as Morales sat there, she felt a pulse inside the silence. Some cases whispered. This one called out. That afternoon, she walked into the captain's office with the folder in her hand. He looked up, eyebrows raised. Something wrong with the scanning project? No, she said. Something right, he sighed. Which means more work, doesn't it? Morales smiled faintly. Maybe. But if there's any DNA evidence left in the evidence locker, this one might finally speak. He leaned back in his chair. That's an old file, Morales. It's been looked at before, more than once. We've got missing kids, active warrants, budget meetings. I know, she interrupted softly, but there's something about this one. Someone cared enough to tell us not to forget her. The captain stared at her for a long moment, then nodded toward the door. Fine. If you want to waste your evenings on it, be my guest. Just don't let it eat into your caseload. That night, after everyone had gone home, Morales walked down to the evidence locker. The room was cold and smelled of metal and disinfectant. Rows of shelves stretched into the dim light, each lined with boxes tagged by decade. She found the one she was looking for, Case 79-214, Jane Doe, River. It was heavier than she expected. Inside, everything was still there, the leather suitcase still faintly stained from the river water, the blanket sealed in a transparent bag, small envelopes labeled hair, fibers, bone sample. Her gloved hands trembled slightly as she lifted the envelope marked bone sample. A single fragment sat inside, white and clean, preserved all these years. Someone had thought ahead. She held it under the fluorescent light, the words echoing in her mind. Please preserve, she whispered. You're still here. Over the next week, she began digitizing the full record. Every photo scanned, every note transcribed. She retyped the handwritten entries by Detective Hale, line by line, careful not to alter a single word. There was something strangely intimate about it, like reading someone's unfinished letter. In his final note, dated 1994, the year he retired, Hale had written, "No new leads, technology changing. Perhaps one day someone will be able to ask questions I couldn't." She stopped typing. Her chest tightened. It felt as if she were answering him directly, decades later. "We can now," she whispered. Morales contacted the state lab in Springfield the following Monday. She explained what she had found, asked if the old bone sample could be reprocessed for modern DNA sequencing. The technician on the other end was skeptical. 40 years? That's a long shot. The sample's probably degraded beyond use. Probably, she said. But can we try? He paused. Send it. We'll see what we can do. She sealed the envelope carefully and prepared the shipping forms. Before she handed it off to the courier, she looked at it one last time. After all this time, she murmured, maybe the river's ready to tell us something. Weeks turned into months. Spring turned to summer. The file sat open on her desk even when she wasn't working it, the photograph of the girl staring softly from the corner. Every so often Morales would glance at it, wondering about the life that had existed before that moment by the river. Who had she loved? What had she dreamed of? What song was playing the last time she laughed? Late one August afternoon, Morales received an email from the state lab. Subject line, Preliminary DNA Viability, Jane Doe, 1979. She clicked it, pulse rising. Inside a single sentence. DNA successfully extracted, full genome profile in process. She leaned back, staring at the screen. After 40 years, there was finally a pulse in the case, a heartbeat of data, a whisper of identity returning. She exhaled slowly. "Okay," she said aloud, as if speaking to the girl in the photo. "We've got your voice now. Let's find your name." That night, long after the office lights went dark, Morales sat alone at her desk. The only light came from the computer screen and the desk lamp glowing softly against the photograph. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, rain tapping against the window. She flipped the photograph over. On the back, in faint pencil, someone had written, "LaSalle County, October 1979. She ran her thumb over the words, feeling the indentation left by an old hand. Then she placed it back in the file and whispered to the empty room, "I'll finish what he started." Outside, the storm broke open, and the sound of rain against the glass sounded almost like a river returning to life. The package arrived at the Springfield Forensic Genetics Lab on a humid morning in early September. It was small, just a padded envelope with the return address of LaSalle County Sheriff's Department, marked in black ink, "Evidence Sample, Jane Doe 1979, handle with care." Inside, a single bone fragment, no larger than a thumb joint, sat in a sterile vial. The clerk signed it in, logged it into the National Evidence Registry, and handed it to the senior forensic biologist, Dr. Leah Tran. Tran was in her 40s, a precise woman with calm hands and a reputation for resurrecting lost identities from forgotten cases. She'd worked dozens of exhumations and cold case profiles, and she knew exactly what she was holding. 40 years of silence condensed into a few grams of calcium and memory. She held the vial up to the light, turning it gently. "Let's see what time left for us," she murmured. The first step was cleaning. Contamination was the enemy. The sample was placed in a UV chamber to sterilize the surface, then shaved carefully with a diamond blade until only the innermost uncontaminated tissue remained. It took 3 days just to prepare it. Then came the decalcification, soaking the fragment in chemical solution until the hard mineral shell dissolved and the inner marrow could be accessed. Every motion was slow, deliberate. Time had hardened the bone, but beneath that, human DNA still waited, curled deep inside, defying decay. When the centrifuge finally stopped spinning, the result was a clear liquid containing fragments of genetic code, a sequence of letters written decades earlier in the cells of a young woman whose name no one remembered. Tran held the vial in her hand, studying it. "This," she said softly, "is her voice." The extracted DNA was divided into 2 sets, one for short tandem repeat STR analysis, the standard used in law enforcement databases, the other for whole genome sequencing, the kind used in genealogy testing. Traditional STR wouldn't help much. Without a reference sample, there was nothing to match it against. But genealogy? That was different. It didn't need an exact match. It just needed family. That's what made this new era of forensics revolutionary. Where older systems looked for fingerprints, genealogy looked for echoes, shared pieces of DNA passed down through generations, the invisible threads connecting strangers across time. And sometimes those threads could lead home. In late September, the lab confirmed what Morales had been hoping for. The genetic profile was strong enough to upload to GEDmatch, an open-source genealogy database used by investigators across the country. It was a long process. Weeks of computing, cross-referencing millions of profiles from people who had taken ancestry tests for curiosity, not knowing that their family trees might one day solve a mystery. When the upload completed, the system began its slow, silent work. At first, nothing happened. The database returned only distant matches, 4th and 5th cousins scattered across the Midwest. Morales visited the lab twice that month, staring at the screen as names she didn't recognize flickered across the monitor like static. She'd ask, "So what do we do now?" Dr. Tran would reply calmly, "We wait." Every match is a thread, enough threads, and we can start weaving the story back together. Waiting became its own kind of ritual. Morales checked the results every morning before starting her shift. Most days there was nothing new, just the same distant relatives, the same low-probability scores. She told herself not to lose hope. If the sample had survived this long, it could survive a little longer. Then, in November, a new alert appeared. New match detected, 0.21% shared DNA. Estimated relation, third to fourth cousin. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start a family tree. Morales and Tran worked side by side in the small lab office. They built branches on the screen, names, birthplaces, marriage records, obituaries. Each one led to another. Every family tree began to connect, slowly converging toward a single surname cluster: Jensen. The earliest relatives came from Michigan, the data showed. Rural counties, small towns, families with roots stretching back generations. Morales stared at the growing network of names. Could be anywhere from 20 to 100 people in that family line, Tran said. But if we find one branch with a missing daughter from the late 70s, she didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what it would mean. It took another 2 months of digging through public records, obituaries, and archived missing person bulletins. Then, one late evening in January, Morales found her. Elaine Jensen, born 1957, Grand Rapids, Michigan. Reported missing October 1979 while traveling to Chicago by bus. Age 22, last seen carrying a sketchbook and a green wool coat. Morales felt the air leave her lungs. She whispered, "It's her." She cross-checked the police report. Elaine's height, 5 feet 4 inches. Weight, around 100 pounds. Last known outfit, green jacket, jeans, brown boots. Everything matched. The next step was confirmation. They needed a living relative. Through genealogy records, they found Elaine's mother, still alive, now in her 90s, living in a small nursing home in northern Michigan. Her name was Margaret Jensen. She had spent 40 years believing her daughter had simply disappeared into the world. Morales called the local sheriff's office there and arranged a visit. 2 weeks later, Margaret's DNA sample, a simple cheek swab, was sent to Springfield. The results took only days. When the notification arrived, Morales sat at her desk, hands trembling, afraid to open it. Then she did. Match confirmed. 99.97%. The girl in the river was Elaine Jensen. After 43 years, she had her name back. Morales printed the result, held the paper for a long moment. Then she whispered what every detective who'd ever worked the case had wanted to say, "Welcome home." She thought of Hale's note in the file. "Perhaps one day someone will be able to ask questions I couldn't," she smiled softly. "We did, Raymond." And she answered. That evening, Morales visited the cemetery where the unidentified grave still stood. The marker was weathered, the paint flaking, but still legible. She placed a new bouquet of white chrysanthemums on the ground, the same kind someone had been leaving all those years ago. A small brass plate sat beside it, freshly engraved. Elaine Marie Jensen, 1957 to 1979, identified 2022. The sky above the river was turning orange as the sun dipped below the trees. The current shimmered gold, carrying fragments of light downstream. For the first time in decades, the river felt peaceful again, like it had finally released the name it had kept for so long. The email arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. No sirens, no calls, no headlines. Just a single notification in Detective Morales' inbox, Case 79-214, DNA confirmation, parental match, 99.97%. Subject identified as Elaine Marie Jensen. For a moment, she didn't move. The words on the screen blurred slightly, the way they do when something inside you shifts. When the world, for just a second, exhales. Then she read it again, and the truth settled in like sunlight after a long storm. After 43 years, Jane Doe number 17, the girl in the river, had a name. She printed the report, 3 crisp pages of pure data that felt more sacred than anything she had ever held. Then she picked up the phone. Margaret Jensen was 92 years old. Her voice, when she answered the call, was thin and tremulous, but steady. She'd been living in a nursing home in Grand Rapids, surrounded by fading wallpaper and the quiet hum of old memories. "Mrs. Jensen, this is Detective Anna Morales from LaSalle County, Illinois. I'm calling about your daughter, Elaine." There was silence on the line, the kind that feels like gravity. Then the old woman said softly, "You found her, didn't you?" Morales's throat tightened. "Yes, ma'am, we did." Margaret began to cry, the sound fragile but whole, like a door opening in a room that had been sealed for decades. Is she home?" she whispered. "She will be," Morales said gently. "We're bringing her home." That evening, Morales drove to the river. The same bend where the fisherman had found the suitcase all those years ago still looked untouched. Reeds bending in the wind, water glinting with the last light of the sun. She stood there with the printed report in her hand. "This is where it ends," she said quietly, though she knew the river wasn't listening, or maybe it always had been. The wind carried her voice away, mingling it with the soft hiss of the current. She thought of Hale, the detective who had written, "Please preserve." He'd never lived to see this day. He'd died in 2008. His obituary, a few short lines in the local paper, no mention of the case that had defined his life. But in a way, this was his victory too. Morales made a note to visit his grave after she spoke with the Jensen family. 2 weeks later, she drove north to Michigan. It was late February, the world caught between winter and spring. Snow clung to the edges of the highway, and the air smelled faintly of thawing soil. At the nursing home, Margaret was waiting in a small lounge room, a plaid blanket across her knees. Her hands trembled when Morales entered, but her eyes, pale blue and clouded with age, were bright with understanding. Morales sat across from her and unfolded a photo. It was the same reconstruction sketch drawn in 1979, faded but recognizable. "Is this her?" she asked softly. Margaret stared at it for a long time before nodding. "That's my Elaine. She used to draw rivers, said they made her feel calm. I guess that's where she ended up." Her voice broke, but there was no anger in it, only relief and something close to peace. "She was coming home," Margaret said. "She was supposed to come home that week. I kept her room ready for years." Morales reached across the table, her hand resting lightly over the old woman's. "She's not lost anymore," she said. "We're arranging to move her to Michigan. You'll have her near you." When Morales left the nursing home, she sat in her car for a long time, staring at the snow falling against the windshield. Her chest ached with the strange mixture that came with closure, the beauty of the answer and the grief of what it cost. The case was solved, but the loss was eternal. On the drive back, she stopped in LaSalle to see the cemetery. The brass plate with Elaine's name had been polished, and a new headstone was being prepared. Workers would soon move her remains to Michigan. But Morales needed to see her here one last time, where the story had been silent for so long. The air was still. The river, just beyond the hill, whispered faintly through the trees. Morales whispered, "We found you." A month later, in April 2022, a small ceremony took place in Grand Rapids. Elaine's ashes were interred beside her father, beneath a flowering dogwood tree. The gravestone read, "Elaine Marie Jensen, 1957 to 1979. Found, named, and home again." Reporters came, not many, just a handful from local outlets. They asked about the science, the process, the breakthrough. Morales answered each question carefully, focusing not on technology, but on humanity. "It wasn't just DNA that solved this," she said. "It was persistence. It was faith. It was one detective writing a note that said, 'Please preserve.' That's what solved it." The reporters wrote that line down. They didn't realize how literal it was. After the service, Margaret sat in her wheelchair beneath the tree, the spring light warm on her face. She looked up at Morales and smiled faintly. "You gave her back to me," she said. "You gave her name back to the world." Morales shook her head. "She always had it. We just had to find it." Margaret nodded. "When I die, I want her photo next to mine. I don't want her to be alone anymore." Morales felt tears prick her eyes. She never was. They sat in silence for a long time, the wind moving gently through the branches above them. The sound was soft, almost like water moving over stone. When Morales returned to Illinois, she stopped by the graveyard where Hale was buried. His stone was small, simple. Raymond E. Hale, 1938 to 2008. She placed a single white chrysanthemum on it, the same kind left at Elaine's grave for years. Then she set down a copy of the identification report, folded neatly in a plastic sleeve. "You kept your promise," she said quietly. "She has her name now." The wind blew across the grass, carrying the scent of rain and river water. Morales stood there until the clouds broke open and the first drops began to fall. She smiled faintly. It felt right. It felt like the story had finally come full circle. But the river didn't stop flowing. It moved on, as it always had, carrying its reflections of sky and memory. Somewhere along its length, perhaps in the reeds or the shallows, a single fragment of that old suitcase still rested beneath the mud, and if the current ever whispered through it just right, perhaps it still said her name, softly, gently, like a prayer the water never forgot. Before the headlines, before the river, before the silence that followed her name for more than 4 decades, there was simply Elaine. Elaine Marie Jensen was born in 1957 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. She was the middle child in a family of 5, a family of modest means but steady warmth. Her father, Harold Jensen, worked as a machinist at the local tool company. Her mother, Margaret, stayed home, raising 3 children on one income, always managing to make the house smell like bread and soap. From the beginning, Elaine was different from the others. While her brothers played baseball in the yard, she preferred the company of her sketchbook. She drew the shapes of trees, the slope of the roofs across the street, the faces of neighbors who passed by and smiled at the quiet little girl sitting cross-legged on the porch. In her high school yearbook, beneath a picture of a slender girl with straight brown hair and serious eyes, the caption read, "Dreams in pencil, drawn from life." Those words would outlive nearly everyone who wrote them. Elaine graduated in the spring of 1975. She had no interest in marriage or small-town predictability. Her art teacher, Mrs. Bowman, remembered her as a girl who wanted to see the world, but who noticed the smallest things in it. That fall, she enrolled in a community art program in Lansing, traveling 2 hours by bus each week. She supported herself with part-time work at a bookstore and took commissions, mostly portraits of pets and children, for $5 each. In those years, she wrote letters often. They weren't dramatic or confessional, just small records of a life unfolding. "Dear Mom, I saw the river freeze this morning. It made a sound like glass breaking. I drew it. I think I'm starting to understand what stillness looks like." Her handwriting was neat and rounded, each word spaced carefully apart. By the summer of 1979, Elaine was 22 and restless. She wanted to move to Chicago. She had been accepted into a small art collective there, nothing official, just a few young artists renting a space in the South Loop, painting and selling small prints at weekend markets. Her parents were nervous. Chicago felt enormous compared to Grand Rapids, but Elaine was determined. "I need to see things for myself," she told her mother over dinner one evening. "I can't paint what I haven't lived." Margaret remembered the way she said it, not defiant, just certain. Elaine packed light, a small suitcase with clothes, a green wool coat, her sketchbook, and a portfolio of drawings bound with twine. She promised to call when she arrived. The morning she left, the sky was gray, but she said it felt like possibility. She hugged her mother tightly, waved to her brothers, and boarded a Greyhound bound south. Her bus ticket was stamped October 4th, 1979. She reached Chicago that evening, Witnesses later placed her at a youth hostel near Wabash Avenue, checking in under her own name, paying cash for 3 nights. No one knows exactly what happened next. Detectives later reconstructed the days that followed from receipts and interviews. She spent her first day exploring the Riverwalk, sketching the bridges and reflections of skyscrapers in the water. That night, she mailed a postcard to her mother, made it safely. City's big but beautiful. Met a few other artists here. Will call soon. Love, Elaine. The postcard arrived 3 days after she vanished. Her last known sighting came from a waitress at a diner near Joliet, southwest of Chicago. The waitress remembered her because she was quiet, polite, and carried a sketchbook. She ordered coffee and pie, sat by the window, and drew something for almost an hour. She kept looking out at the water, the waitress said later. There's a small river behind the diner. I remember thinking she looked peaceful. A man sat 2 tables away, late 30s, wearing a mechanic's jacket, road dust on his boots. He spoke to her briefly when he paid his bill. She smiled politely. He left first. She left a few minutes later. No one saw her after that. When police investigated years later, they learned that the man had worked at a garage near the highway. He had a record: minor assaults, theft, 1 arrest for harassment. By the time investigators connected him to the area, he was long dead. No evidence directly tied him to Elaine. But the pattern fit. Morales read the old interview transcripts, the way the waitress had described that moment. 2 strangers, 1 conversation, a girl with a sketchbook walking out into dusk. She imagined Elaine stepping into the cooling October air, her green coat buttoned to her neck, the sound of the river nearby. Perhaps the man offered her a ride. Perhaps she declined. Perhaps something changed in an instant. A word, a gesture, a moment that decided everything that followed. Whatever happened next, the world closed around her quietly. A struggle, a blow, water closing over, a blanket wrapped by a trembling hand, a suitcase shut in silence. For years, Margaret Jensen replayed that same imagined scene in her mind. The details shifted with time. Sometimes Elaine ran, sometimes she didn't. Sometimes there was mercy in it, sometimes only fear. Every version ended with the same ache, not knowing. She kept Elaine's room intact for 20 years. The sketchbook on the desk, the bed neatly made, a jar of dried paintbrushes beside the window. On the wall hung one of her daughter's drawings, a pencil sketch of a riverbank with bare trees and a single line beneath it. Everything moves, even what looks still. When Morales saw the drawing years later in Margaret's home, she felt a chill. Elaine had unknowingly drawn her own metaphor, the stillness that would define her legacy. In 2022, when Elaine's remains were finally reburied, her brothers attended the service. They spoke softly to reporters afterward. Their hair had gone gray, their voices hoarse with age, but the way they spoke of her carried a kind of tenderness that time hadn't touched. She was quiet, one of them said, but she noticed everything. Even as a kid, she'd stop and sketch a puddle because the reflection looked interesting to her. She had that kind of heart, the other brother added. I think she'd be glad people remember her for what she loved, not for what happened. Morales stood at a distance, listening, realizing how close the living always stand to the lost, even when years try to separate them. After the service, Margaret held Morales's hand and pressed a folded page into it. It was a letter she'd written years earlier and never mailed, a letter addressed to her daughter. Morales unfolded it later, sitting in her car. Dear Elaine, if you're out there, I hope you see the river again. I hope it's peaceful, not frightening. I've learned to forgive the world for what it took because it gave me you first. Love, Mom Morales folded the letter carefully, placed it back in her pocket, and started the car. The road ahead curved along the same river that had taken and then returned Elaine's name. The evening light shimmered on the surface, the color of brushed gold. She whispered into the quiet, "You were loved the whole time." The news broke quietly, not with headlines or breaking alerts, but with a 2-paragraph article buried on page 7 of the Grand Rapids Daily. Missing Michigan woman identified, After 43 years through DNA, body discovered in 1979, Illinois River case, confirmed as Elaine Jensen. It wasn't loud, but it didn't have to be. In the Jensen household, what was left of it, it felt like the world itself had stopped to listen. When the story reached local television, reporters called it the miracle of modern science. Neighbors called it the saddest kind of relief. But for Margaret Jensen, the mother who had waited nearly half a century, it wasn't a miracle or a headline. It was simply an ending she could finally hold. She sat in her recliner as the news played, her eyes reflecting the flicker of the television screen. On it, they showed the riverbank in Illinois, the grave, the headstone engraved with her daughter's name. Margaret reached out, fingertips brushing the screen. "She looks at peace," she whispered. When the call came that Elaine's remains were ready to be returned home, the arrangements began immediately. Her two sons, David and Mark, handled the paperwork. They were men in their 60s now, each with children of their own, each quietly carrying the invisible weight of a sister they'd lost when they were still young. The day the transport van arrived from Illinois, the brothers stood side by side in the driveway, hands clasped behind their backs, their mother watching from the porch. The driver opened the door, and a small oak box was carried out with quiet reverence. No police escort, no fanfare, just the soft rhythm of careful footsteps on the walkway. Margaret rose from her chair and took a step forward. Her hand trembled as she reached out, resting her fingers lightly on the smooth lid. She whispered her daughter's name, Elaine. For the first time in 43 years, it wasn't a plea, it was an answer. The reburial was planned for a Sunday morning in late spring. The air smelled of lilac and fresh-cut grass, the kind of gentle warmth that comes after a long winter. Grand Rapids Memorial Cemetery had prepared a small space beside her father's grave, beneath a dogwood tree that had just begun to bloom. Family, old friends, and a handful of community members gathered quietly. There were no police uniforms, no cameras flashing. Only a few journalists from local stations stood at the edge, taking notes with respectful distance. At the front, a framed photo rested on an easel, a portrait of Elaine taken when she was 20. She was smiling slightly, her hair tucked behind her ear, holding a charcoal pencil in her hand. It was the only photograph Margaret had kept in her purse for all those years. A pastor began with a prayer, his voice steady but soft. He spoke about closure, about love surviving time, about how even rivers, patient as they are, eventually return what they take. Margaret's wheelchair was pushed forward so she could place the flowers herself. She reached down, laying a small bouquet of white chrysanthemums, the same kind that had appeared on Elaine's grave in Illinois for decades. Her hand lingered on the wood of the coffin, as if to feel the heartbeat of the years that had passed between them. "I told you I'd find you," she said, her voice trembling. "I just didn't know it would take this long." Her son stood behind her, silent. Mark placed a hand on her shoulder. David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, the same way he had when he was a child. When the pastor finished the final prayer, the small crowd stood in silence. A breeze moved through the dogwood branches above them, scattering a few white petals that drifted down onto the fresh earth like snow. After the ceremony, the family gathered at Margaret's home for coffee and sandwiches. Simple, familiar, grounding. Reporters had asked for interviews, but the brothers declined. "This isn't a story," Mark said. "It's our sister." Inside the house, the old furniture still carried the scent of cedar polish and memory. On the mantel, framed photographs stretched across decades, birthdays, graduations, weddings. In the center stood the newest one, Elaine's headstone, sunlight glinting off its fresh engraving. Margaret asked for her sketchbook. It had been packed away years earlier, wrapped in tissue paper. Her sons brought it to her, and she opened it slowly. The pages were fragile but intact, sketches of rivers, trees, faces. On one page, a half-finished drawing of water flowing around rocks. In the margin, Elaine had written a single line in pencil, "The current always finds its way home." Margaret traced the words with her finger and smiled through her tears. She knew, she whispered. Even then, she knew. Detective Morales attended quietly at the back of the service. She didn't speak during the ceremony, didn't want attention, but afterward she introduced herself to the family. David shook her hand, his eyes bright with gratitude. "You're the one who found her," he said. Morales shook her head. "Your mother found her. She never stopped looking. We just had the tools to listen." He nodded, understanding, and guided his mother toward her. Margaret reached out, gripping Morales's hand with surprising strength. Her skin was paper-thin, but her gaze was clear. "You gave me back my girl," she said. Morales felt a lump rise in her throat. "She gave herself back, ma'am. We just helped her speak." Margaret smiled faintly. "You sound like her." She used to say that art was how people spoke when words didn't work. When the guests left, Morales stayed behind for a few moments. She stood beneath the dogwood tree, the sunlight breaking through the leaves, and thought of all the people whose stories still waited in boxes, still labeled unidentified. She thought of Detective Hale, his handwriting on the note that had saved everything. She thought of the river, the fisherman, the years of silence, the technology that had finally bridged the distance between time and truth. It struck her that what had solved the case wasn't just science, it was patience. Human patience, the kind that outlives generations. That evening, she drove back toward Illinois. The highway curved alongside stretches of the same river where Elaine had been found. The water caught the last of the sunset, glowing like a sheet of fire. She rolled down the window and let the air rush in, carrying the faint scent of rain and soil. In that moment, the road hummed beneath her tires, the sky darkened to violet, and somewhere between memory and motion, she realized the story was no longer about death. It was about return, about how every lost thing, given enough time, finds its way back to a place, a name, or a heart that never stopped waiting. She whispered into the wind, as if speaking directly to the current, "She's home now." And the wind, steady and warm, seemed to answer her back. The river moves the same way it always has. It bends, it curves, it carries silt and sunlight downstream without pause or memory. Yet somehow it remembers everything that touches it. It remembers the girl who once walked along its banks, who drew its surface in her sketchbook, who disappeared beneath its quiet current, and who came back to it one last time, as a name reclaimed from silence. In the end, it wasn't luck that found her. It wasn't science alone, or the precision of machines. It was something smaller, more human, the simple act of not forgetting. The file labeled Jane Doe number 17-1979 no longer sits in the cold case cabinet. It rests in an archive drawer marked Closed, Identified, beside a short note handwritten by Detective Anna Morales, Elaine Marie Jensen, found through patience, science, and love. Case closed, but story remembered. On the back of that note, Morales added a single line copied from Elaine's sketchbook, "The current always finds its way home." A few months after the reburial, Morales returned once more to the Illinois River. The water was low that summer, the mud banks cracked and dry. The reeds whispered softly in the wind, and dragonflies skimmed the surface like living shards of glass. She walked to the same bend where the suitcase had once been found, and stood there a long time. The world had changed. The road nearby was busier now. A new bridge crossed farther upstream. But the air, the sound of the current, even the smell of damp soil, it all felt the same. She set a small stone in the mud just above the waterline. It was smooth and gray, worn by time. On it, she'd etched a single word with a pocket knife: home. Then she whispered, "You made it, Elaine." She waited, listening to the soft murmur of the river. Somewhere in that sound, she could almost hear a reply, faint, distant, and kind. Back in Grand Rapids, Margaret Jensen kept the photograph of her daughter beside her bed. Some nights she would talk to it, the way she used to when her children were young and asleep in the next room. She'd tell her about the birds in the garden, about the nurses who brought her tea, about the snow melting outside the window. It was enough. When she passed away a year later, the framed photo was still there. Her sons placed it in her hands before closing the casket, the same way she'd once laid flowers on her daughter's grave. They buried her beside Elaine, beneath the same dogwood tree. Now when the wind blows, the branches sway just enough to make the petals fall like soft rain over both graves. In LaSalle County, the fisherman who first found the suitcase never forgot either. He was an old man by the time the case was solved. When he read the article about the identification, he told his daughter, "I always knew she had a name. I just didn't know how long it would take to hear it." He kept that clipping folded in his wallet until the day he died. Every story leaves echoes, some in paper, some in people, some in the quiet places where no one thinks to look. For Elaine, her echo began in a river and ended in the voices of those who refused to stop listening. Detective Morales went on to head the state's new cold case identification program. Each time she opened a new file labeled unidentified, she would whisper the same words before starting, "Everyone deserves a name." Sometimes she found one, sometimes she didn't. But she always remembered the first voice that spoke back through the years. As the years passed, the story of the girl in the river became more than an investigation. It became a symbol, a quiet reminder that time does not erase truth. It only hides it until someone cares enough to look again. And when the right hands reach into the dark, even the most silent stories rise to the surface. 43 years. That's how long it took for a name to return from the river. Elaine Marie Jensen, a daughter, an artist, a traveler who loved the sound of moving water. She vanished in a moment, but her story never stopped flowing. It wound through time, through paper, through memory, through science, until at last it came home. Because the river remembers, because people remember, because somewhere between silence and persistence, truth always finds its way back.